Hey guys, it's Bella, and we are back with Simon Webb of History Debunked, and we are reading through and discussing this textbook, An Introduction to Critical Race Theory, by Richard Delgado and John Stefansis. I don't know if I butchered those names. And I literally just picked it because it seemed like a good first introduction to the subject of critical race theory, and we can just dive in with the introduction and see what we think about it, really. I'm going to skip talking about the foreword because it's just about it's mostly about Angela Harris's personal life and not too relevant. So, acknowledgements. Here we are in introduction. So I'm just curious in general, Simon, what your general impression was from reading the first chapter.
It's a series of anecdotes, or hypothetical anecdotes, I should say, and it starts off in a very misleading way because um, often white people and black people have different body language, they use language differently, they often have different types of behavior. There's bound to be confusion. There's bound to be confusion and misunderstanding about things like the amount of eye contact that's made, how close people stand towards each other, how often they smile. These things vary. If you take some Caribbeans that are brought up in Britain, they're going to behave differently to often white people that were brought up in Britain. So these misunderstandings don't look to me as though they're anything more significant than that, simply minor cultural misunderstandings.
Yeah, so I do feel that's a big weakness of this book, that it sort of acknowledges that, and that's what I highlighted here with this example they give of what precisely it was. A few different kinds of interactions you can have. So a child raises their hand repeatedly, and the teacher recognizing the child or not. A shopper hands a cashier a $5 bill, the clerk smiling or making small talk, because you mentioned smiling exactly. And they say that when discussing how a white person and a person of color might react to it, they say that the white person is less likely to think of it as a racial thing, and the person of color may regard it as or may think of it as a racial issue. And you're right that a lot of the time these things can simply be misunderstandings, and they cover that a bit here because they say sometimes actions like these stem from mere rudeness or indifference. And you're right in it's a cultural misunderstanding to some extent, where there's also evidence just in research of this, right, that the same behaviors when done by black people get read as more aggressive or various other things, particularly in schools, as
Yeah, yeah.
disruptive. I mean, just anecdotally, I would kids, rocking back on their chair would get in trouble, but usually black students who did it got pulled up much, much more often than white students, even if they
Yeah,
did it basically
that's
the same
true.
amount. Yeah, and so this I highlighted here, and I commented on this bit about microaggressions. Then that it's a bit more of a emotive than a helpful description of what microaggressions are, and I got the sense from reading through this book that they're assuming a readership which is already on board with the concepts and vaguely familiar with them, so they don't need to fully explain or give reference to.
There's a glossary at the end, At
I didn't realize that.
the end of the book, there's a glossary explaining terms like microaggression.
Well, actually, let's have a look then, because I'm curious what they say for
Yeah,
microaggression.
it's a very odd thing. He describes it as a stunning small incident, which
Okay.
seems to me a really odd way of putting it.
Yes. Because I mean, some
But,
microaggressions can be a
yeah,
bit
yeah.
stunning.
Keep going.
Yeah, microaggression. Oops. My microaggression. Yeah, stunning small encounter with racism. Oh, I think I know what they're trying to get at with this. They're
Yeah,
trying to get at that for the person who is the recipient of this, they can be a bit stunning, they can put you on edge, they can be a bit alarming. Um,
I can't imagine why. If racism is as endemic as the authors make out, I would think most people would be used to it if there is such a thing as microaggression. And these are things which nobody else, almost by definition, can see, aren't they? it's not. I'm trying to think how I can put this, Bella. Okay, say back in the 1970s, I've seen things, for example, you would get a pub full of white people and they're standing at the bar trying to get served, and there would be an unofficial policy of not serving black people. So a black person would stand there indefinitely until he got the message that he wasn't welcome in the pub. I've seen that. That certainly is a thing that used to happen. It doesn't happen now. But that's not a microaggression at all. That is out and out racism. That is in effect a colour bar. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. I mean, I think they would. I think these. Yeah. There's precise definition of where something becomes a microaggression or a macroaggression in different terms. It's imprecise. I think Dr. Daryl Sue, who wrote the book on microaggressions. Now, granted, he's talking about this from a clinical psychiatrist perspective. He might define the difference between what you described as a macroaggression. Sorry, a
Oh,
micro. Sorry, it still is being a microaggression because it's not something which has the backing of a larger institution behind it. Because I don't know if this was the law at the time, but if that black customer had got the law involved and said, "Well, hey, they're discriminating against me. They're not letting me. They're clearly not serving me," and the law said, "Well, they have a right to not serve you." That would be, I think, a macroaggression because that's an institution of society more than just a handful of individuals saying that it's wrong. Whereas a microaggression, I think what it refers to is an action done by a small, like that's the micro part number of people. So it's the microness of the people doing it, I think, rather than the significance of the impact on the person. And I think that's why in this book they describe it as stunning because reactions to microaggressions can vary in several degrees. I mean, I know that within the trans community there are some things that are huge microaggressions for some people really aren't that big a microaggression for others. One
give
of
me an
them,
example.
yeah, yeah. So a practice which people find rather some people find very annoying is the practice of automatically either stating or asking for somebody's pronouns in any situation. And some people say that you should do it based on this idea that the way somebody looks doesn't automatically tell you what kind of pronouns they would prefer. So somebody can look very masculine and still prefer they, them, or she, her pronouns, and vice versa. So asking is a courtesy, and it's a statement that pronouns are a bit like names in that you don't know until someone's told you what they are and that the person has the say on what their pronouns should be, just as a matter of courtesy and respect. In a lot of trans circles and just other circles, it's become common to stage pronouns, whether in a badge or whatever. Like on Discord, my I have my pronouns in brackets and people put them in their Twitter profiles. But some even transgender people feel this as a microaggression because it can feel as if this matter only gets brought up as a means of signaling that a trans person is there. So I don't know, in a ContraPoints is a famous trans YouTuber, and she has talked about this on Twitter, where she'll go into a sports bar and people will just be using female pronouns for her all the time, and nobody questions it. But then she goes into these liberal leftist spaces, and they ask her pronouns, and she has to go through it, and it feels as if they're bringing gender to the forefront of her life in a way that is not experienced elsewhere, and it can feel a bit uncomfortable for her. That is a sort of microaggression that she has talked about. She acknowledges that it's a very tiny and insignificant thing. So in her case, it's not a big deal. But some people react very negatively to either being asked for their pronouns or for not being asked for their pronouns. So I just want to emphasize that the micro bit I don't think relates to how it affects the individual. It's
Sure.
about the size of the people doing it.
But that's a really interesting point because it strikes me as absolutely trifling. I might mention that I get on the telephone, I sometimes get taken for a woman, for an old woman, and other times as a gay man. I'm not the most masculine person in the world. And I come across sometimes on the telephone. I mean, if I ring up to book theatre tickets, very often I'll get taken for either a gay man. I've had gay men say, "Oh, just a minute, dear," like that. And I don't know whether they assume I'm a woman or a gay man or what it is. Sometimes, definitely, I've been called madam, because I've got a voice a little bit like Margaret Rutherford in the old films. But I can't imagine why that would bother anybody. I can't understand why. being referred to as a different gender from my own sense would be of any conceivable interest to me. It's funny,
Well,
but
okay, so in the case of transgender people, usually, and this is a matter that this book is also, I think, a bit bad at talking about. Um, the note that I wrote for this is that the example they give of these microaggressions, I said, the questions they're asking, like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you immediately think that you might be treated this way because you're not white? I'd say they don't give the context of a non-white person having experienced many similar incidents beforehand. And if you've experienced lots of incidents like that, it makes it difficult for you to read these incidents as amusing one-offs or rare one-offs. And like, if we take the case for trans people, like, transitioning is very important for us. Trans people go through a lot of some of it is literally legal. There are some legal rights trans people do not have. If I were to be to get married, for instance, the name on the marriage certificate would be my old name and not my current name, not my legal name. I would also be registered, I believe, as a father to the child rather than a mother. There was a case of a trans man who fought a case in the Supreme Court and
I'm
ruled.
fully
Yeah,
familiar with the case, Bella. Yes,
yeah.
indeed.
So these are legal issues. Also, with regards to trans issues, there's the fact that trans people wait far longer for healthcare than is acceptable by NHS guidelines. But
What
that's
do you mean
another
by
matter.
healthcare? Do you mean the gender clinics and so on?
Yeah, yeah. The
Well,
waiting lines for this far exceed. I don't know what
that
the.
depends obviously on where you are. I mean, if you're in London, if you're near Charing Cross Clinic, I'm sure you're familiar with the Charing Cross Clinic in London. If you're in a big city, it's easier than in a small town or a village. But that's the case with all kinds of healthcare and all kinds of complicated procedures. If I
Well,
were transitioning in Manchester or London, it might be easier than if I were living, say, in the north, say, in the Western Isles, in the Hebrides or something.
this is definitely true. I mean, I don't want to go too much into my personal history, but I have been on the Charing Cross wait list for the NHS for a good long time. These,
So I'm not laughing at you. It's
oh, I
just
know.
yes,
But
it
the point is that even within London and Manchester, these big cities, the services often are inadequate. It's not fully the NHS's fault, but there's loads
the
of
waiting
factors
list
that
at
go into it.
Charing Cross used to be 4 months, at one time.
Well, yeah.
No, the reason is that I won't go into the mechanics of the thing here. It has increased massively at one time from an initial referral by the GP to actually getting seen by a guy at Charing Cross was 4 months. Those were in the days when it was John Randall. Are you familiar with the history of all this at all or
John
not?
Randall, I do not
Yeah.
know.
Sorry?
No, I don't know who John Randall is.
John Randall was the guy that founded Charing Cross. He was right. I mean, I'm talking now about 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. But
Right.
anyway, things have changed, and there's various reasons for it.
But anyway, so those would be like macroaggressions, and we're talking here about microaggressions. So I would say that the problem is with trans people that a misgendering, first of all, oftentimes it does have negative invective, right? Calling somebody let's say calling somebody who one perceives as male a sissy is usually meant in a derogatory sense. That's the reason why terms like sissy, the F slur, faggot are not regarded as good words to use, right?
Mm.
So there's a context that they're usually quite negative things to call somebody, but also for trans people and also for other kinds of microaggressions, there's often a history where they've experienced many similar interactions before that make it hard for it to be make it very difficult for them to think, oh, this person's just had a bad day, because that's the example they give for the white person earlier. Might you think that all these people are just having a bad day? And if you experience the same issue over and over again from loads of different people, it can be hard to think that it is just a coincidence, and it starts
No,
to
it
feel
may
like
not
it's
be
something wrong.
coincidence. Again, it may be a cultural thing. It may be your own behaviour. I often get overlooked in shops. I often get left standing, and people don't come to tend to me to see what I want. That's because I have a habit of standing very still. I don't make a noise. I don't cough or draw attention to myself. And I'm the kind of person that blends into the background. So, yes, I have that experience repeatedly that I will stand there and nobody will come and ask me what I want because they expect some sort of body language of, oh, I'm waiting to be served. So, it's entirely possible this is not coincidence. It's also possible, and I've certainly seen this. I've known, I'm thinking now, particularly Caribbeans, even those people of Caribbean origin born in this country, that sometimes have a kind of impatient air about them and they'll start huffing and puffing if they're not served at once. And it's counterproductive because in that case, the staff will drag their feet a little. So, no, it's not coincidental, but there's far more going on here than simple racism.
I would agree, and I think that's an issue with how the book frames it. I think because and Daryl too talks about this in his book. The microaggressions are really complex things and literally very difficult to precisely um, identify. And sometimes, as you say, it may not be a single thing. People may be doing it for multiple reasons. It may be motivate. They may have a degree of racial or homophobic, queerphobic bias motivating their actions, but at the same time, they may. The reason at the forefront of their mind may be that they find this person annoying and such.
Mm.
I think the interplay of these things is not easy to untangle, and I would personally have preferred that they, well, first of all, that they link maybe to, or say that if you want to read more about microaggressions, go to Daryl Sue's book, because that's a big issue with I have with this book in general from the first chapter is that they seem to assume that everyone's familiar with these concepts, which I don't think they necessarily are, and they therefore explain them quite poorly. Some of the language also is a bit emotive. Sorry, like you know, welling up from the assumptions, water dripping on sandstone, consciously or unconsciously. Like that's more sort of that's not very emotional language, but dispiriting, stunning, mar the days of many women and folks of color. I don't know. It feels less. I worry that people would regard that as not worthy of taking seriously because
It's
it
not
uses the
worthy of taking seriously. It's simply an appeal to the emotions. But I mean, there we are. That yes, that's precisely how I read it as well.
well, what I think, what I guess I would defend this book by saying is that the things that they're saying here are backed up by, oftentimes by research and by studies.
But
But
they don't give the studies.
well, that's yeah.
I've noticed this a number of times. For example, they say things like, "Oh, there's the case of a black PhD doesn't
Yeah.
get offered a job when the white college dropout does." Is that an actual case? Is it a thought experiment? There's quite a few things like that where it's possible that they've dreamed these things up to give examples, and it's equally possible it's from research, but they don't say. There's no references.
Absolutely. Like I even highlighted that one because I thought um, it's not a good. It doesn't look good. Weird. Um, I remember that one. I remember thinking that it's not a very, but because any individual example, that's the problem. It can look as if it's pure coincidence, and sometimes it literally is just pure coincidence. I've known people who've talked to me about something that they consider to be a microaggression, which from my perspective, it didn't look like it to me. I would say that maybe it doesn't so much matter what this may sound like a weird way of saying it, but an objective truth may not be as important as what we are meaning when we talk about microaggressions and what we can do with it. So, on the matter of pronouns and courtesy, right? If somebody says that they get misgendered all the time, people use the wrong pronouns for them, and therefore they consider this a microaggression. So, what they're saying when they say that this is a microaggression I'm experiencing, I think they're saying, could you please not do this behavior? And I'm saying that this behavior psychologically harms me. And I think rather than, I don't think the really important thing there is to ask, well, is it objectively true or not? Because, like, this is that's certainly not an academic journal. It's just microaggressions are something in everyday life and social interactions. I think the important thing in somebody talking about microaggressions is they're expressing that something hurts them, and they're asking the people around them to not do it or to avoid doing that out of courtesy. And I think the important thing is to focus on, well, somebody's pointing out a way that we can change our behavior to make society a more welcoming and accommodating place for people. And so that gives us a pointer and we should do it. I think that's a good goal to try to achieve. Now
What
I
for
under
setting other people? And yes, I agree entirely.
Well, yeah, but I understand the wording and the phrasing, like a microaggression. It sounds. I think the problem is, and this is something I've been realizing from the comments that I assume your viewers have been leaving, that I think a lot of times people hear terms like microaggression, and what they hear is they hear somebody telling them that they're a bad person, for things that they don't understand that they've done wrong, in language that they don't understand, and so they react very negatively against it. And part of the reason I wanted to read through critical race theory together is to show people that these things aren't, I think, the attack on them personally that we think they are. And there are opportunities, I think, to have meaningful conversations with people who are negatively affected by, say, racism or transphobia, homophobia in their lives, and to make society better on a personal level when we interact with our friends.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable. I don't think anybody could disagree with that.
I think what I'm saying is I understand why some people see it as unreasonable because they don't hear all of that. They hear a buzzword that sounds like I'm saying that they're a terrible person and that they need to be cancelled, excised from society. Where I don't think that's what the term microaggression means. Even Derald Sue in his book, he doesn't really think that people who commit microaggressions are terrible, bad people. It's just a matter of let's use this language to identify something. Because what microaggression as a term does is it lets people have a word for something and connect it to broader biases, which otherwise they wouldn't have had a word for. Like all of these examples that he gives, raising a hand and not being taken seriously, the clerk not smiling, and somebody not helping her. Now you say you've experienced a couple of these, and I very much I don't doubt that you have. The point being that I think the implication of this book, but again, it's a flaw in the authors that they implied it and didn't say it, is that a person of color, because of biases which we both acknowledge exist in society, they're more likely to experience these negative things than white people are, or straight people, or whatever, cis passing people. And so, what is it? And therefore, if they didn't have the word microaggression, they wouldn't be able to connect these things to broader cultural issues, broader societal issues, because we acknowledge there's a connection with social attitudes of racism and such. But without the word microaggression, we don't have a way to describe it because all of these are just one-off incidents. And one-off incident as a term is not connected with a social issue, a social matter. You know what I mean?
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, is it certain? Do we really know for certain that black people are more likely not to be smiled at in shops? You know, the difficulty here is that if you question this, okay, it's a proposition, it's an interesting proposition, it's a good hypothesis. Okay, the first thing I have to ask myself is this true? Not is it possible or is it plausible? Is this a real thing? And now we run into difficulties because obviously people of colour are presumed to already have a knowledge of this. They are presumed to be able to detect it automatically, and this is explicitly stated in this chapter.
Yes, let's
And
talk about that because I
yeah,
hate that.
and also he talks too about not being a great fan of the Enlightenment rationalism. So this means two things. It means firstly, you cannot question or ask people about it because that in itself can be seen as an act of aggression or an act of racism. And secondly, it's not up for debate. It's not up because people can win or lose debates. So we have to take it without framing it in the terms that we frame most discourse in. So that's two problems I've got with the whole idea.
Yeah, and here's the quote where he's even saying it. So, unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of
And that
constitutional law.
includes the scientific method, you see. Now, obviously, you're a great fan of the scientific method. When you're looking at an old manuscript, you're going to look at the data that's been collected. You're going to say, looks like a palimpsest. What's underneath it? You'll look at the language. You will use all the Enlightenment rationalism to analyze the whole thing. But he's saying here, well, that's not the big thing.
I mean, I would say no. That I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that. literature or medieval studies are a scientific method because the data that we have can't really be analyzed in many useful scientific ways. We can't often quantify the information we have beyond linguistics. You can, but I'm not in the field of linguistics.
You can with old vellum manuscripts. You can see the age. You can use carbon dating on some of them.
What
There's all sorts of ways that you can use science to analyze old manuscripts.
what I mean is like a scientific hypothesis, like something I was. I'll give an example that I've done a video on my channel. Is a Roman poet called Magnus Felix Ennodius. He writes these really interesting poems, and in these poems, I see him attacking the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who
Hmm.
is ruling over him, and he feels like as a Roman, he doesn't like the fact that he's being ruled over by a barbarian Goth. A bit of old school racism from the Romans, we might say. But so in his poems, he has these very thinly veiled references to Theodoric, and in a bit like microaggressions, there's no way that I can scientifically, or anyone can scientifically or objectively say this is not, this is or isn't a reference to King Theodoric. But I make arguments that, well, this seems to imply this because it relates to these Roman conceptions of barbarianness, but none of these. My argument that Ennodius in these poems is talking about King Theodoric, that can't be scientifically proven or disproven. So it's not like positivist in that
Of
sense.
course, it can't. But at the same time, it's possible to spot whether the Latin usage of a particular time is authentic. It's how people sometimes discover that a manuscript has been forged.
Mm.
You can analyze the language, you can say, well, that's odd because this expression wasn't in use until such and such a date. You can also analyze the ink. I mean, there was the Vinland map, which at one time was thought to show America, long before Columbus. So they analysed the ink on that and discovered that the ink was modern. So science is used a lot in analysing manuscripts, maps, and so on.
They absolutely are. I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of the fundamental claims, or a lot of most of the work of medieval studies, the data just because if we take the poems as data, these poems can't be treated in a quantifiable, scientific, enlightenment, rationalist manner. If we were to try and have a debate as to are these poems by Ennodius talking about Theodoric or not? Because the manuscript, sure, we can definitely scientifically question whether it's authentic when it was written, etc. But as for the question that I'm discussing in the paper I'm writing about, are these poems about King Theodoric? One can't have an Enlightenment style rationalist debate and come to an objective truth as to whether they are right or wrong, because we just don't have good enough data to do that. And we can't replicate the data either. We can't do experiments that test under different conditions whether these poems are about King Theodoric. So that's why I don't consider like history, just a lesser extent archaeology and literature studies to be a kind of science. We can certainly, I think sometimes people mistake Enlightenment rationalism and the scientific method for using evidence. And because they're very well associated, and because this was the first time, well, it wasn't the first time, I should say, but the Enlightenment scientific method or the development of the scientific method after the Enlightenment was one of the first times in which evidence based natural science became really important within the Latin West, as it were. But they I would first of all say that some data just can't be done in that way, but also that there have been disciplines which use evidence which aren't entirely rationalist before the scientific method was developed. Computus is one that I'm most familiar with. So the method of calculating when Easter should be involves a mixture of astronomy, rhetoric, persuasion, and also divine revelation, like mystical miracle revelations. So with those three things together, Computus as a medieval area of study is not really scientific, but it does use evidence because people will say that if you use this computistical calculation, you can see in the sky that the moon is not as big as you say it should be. So they are using kinds of evidence to, in some ways, empirically test their ideas, but they're also not fully rationalist in an Enlightenment sense. So I think that being against Enlightenment rationalism does not mean being against evidence as a concept.
Okay, no, I think that's reasonable.
but again, I fully understand why they get conflated, because in the way that we understand science, we're so used to thinking of natural science as being evidence and fact based, and we associate that so strongly with the Enlightenment for good reason, because that's the point at which, with Isaac Newton and such, that and Roger Bacon and various early scientific thinkers, that natural sciences started to rely exclusively, I suppose, on, or predominantly on, empiricism and evidence-based experimentation, whereas other disciplines still use evidences to support their theses, but just not testing them. Yeah. So let's actually then talk, because you mentioned the matter basically of standpoint epistemology, which they talked about. But so early origins, just a basic thing about how it sprang up in critical race theory sprang up in the 1970s among the legal profession, and then it spread out into other branches of study, and that's why I, as a medieval scholar, have done a bit of it. What I didn't like about this bit here, the critical race theory builds on the insights of two previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism, both of which it owes a large debt. It also draws from
Oh
certain.
no, you mean load turfs responsible? That's terrible.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's radical feminists that aren't TERFs, but I mean, yes. For those who
Oh,
don't know,
come on.
TERFs are it's an acronym for
That's
trans
what turfs
exclusionary
are, Bella.
radical.
I wondered whether it coloured your view of radical feminism. That was all.
No, don't worry. I mean, most radical people calling themselves radical feminists that I've read are quite transphobic, but there are some that aren't. And there's interesting contributions that radical feminism gives even to trans studies. So I don't fully discount anything really.
Yeah.
But anyway, it says here it also draws from certain European philosophers such as Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida. They're sounding like me, which is a bad thing. They need to they need to explain in precise terms what they mean. Because I mean, I've not even read some of these. I've not read any of these writers. I mean, I've read a couple of things by Martin Luther King Jr. and I think one or two things by the Black Panther.
Yes,
Well, not Black
to
Power.
tell the truth, you might not have read anything of hers, certainly.
Yeah, no, exactly. But my point, they say they drop these names. They don't really say how they've contributed or in what meaningful way. And I feel like what purpose does this serve if you're not saying why and what Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, Sojourner Truth contributed?
The,
Maybe they'll
tal-
see it later.
the talisman, you're not meant to ask what they contributed. You're just meant to see the names there. You're meant to see W.E.B. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and immediately understand that they are the right sort of people. It doesn't matter what they said or did.
Well, to be fair, I think, well, first of all, they may explain later in the book. We don't know. But also, I would prefer if these were phrased in the sense of these are some of the backgrounds for critical race theory. We recommend you read them for more. And maybe that's what this is intended to do, to encourage people as a reading list to go on to do other things. I can say because my greatest area of interest is queer studies and gender studies. I've read the introduction books for those topics, and sometimes I've gone back and when there was a really interesting name that was mentioned, I'm like, ooh, I'll have a look at what they said and read the originals of what they wrote. So maybe that's what this is doing. But I agree, it doesn't look too good, I think. Um, here's another one. So this group also built on feminism's insights into the relationship between power and the construction of social roles, as well as the unseen, largely invisible collection of patterns and habits that make up patriarchy and other types of domination.
Waffle.
Well, that's the thing. I worry about this because it's again going to sound like people are going to read this as like they're saying I'm sexist and they're not telling me why, and they're saying that it's my fault for not understanding why because I'm
And every
stupid.
man will be offended to see the expression patriarchy, no doubt.
Well, yes, exactly.
There's
So
half the readership gone immediately.
because I mean, I noticed in some of your videos that you go, well, I don't know what this means. I don't know what any of it means, and I don't blame you. A lot of this stuff, some of it is honestly just deliberately meant to be jargon laced.
Of course.
But also, if one has never had these terms explained, they can seem very alienating and unnecessary. So if because I get my friends asking me sometimes all the time, hey, here's this thing, I have no idea what it means, can you translate it? And if you sit through and really think about it, usually you can get to what they're saying, especially if you're reading like a whole paper. Within the context of a whole paper, you can be like, I get the point they're trying to make, even if this one paragraph is very dense and difficult to say. But if I were to have a stab at what this sentence is trying to get at, it's saying that the group of legal scholars who incorporated skepticism after Brown versus the Board of Education, they were building on insights from feminism, and these insights are about how power constructs social roles. So the way that men and women interact in society. Feminists, particularly of the 1970s and such, wrote about how literal, sometimes legal power at the time informs men and women's social roles. Like at the crudest level, men being breadwinners and women being homemakers, up until relatively recently, women legally could not work, or at least couldn't work as much, or had certain barriers to work, which men didn't have, and that made it easier for them to go into work. So rather than viewing that social role as like a natural thing, like men and women just are naturally more inclined to work, feminists were saying, well, this stuff that looks like it's natural is a consequence of legal power that men have and women don't have, or the women have less of, one could say. And critical race theorists, following incidents like Brown versus the Board of Education, drew on that insight, and they said that racial roles could also be, and racial subcultures can be affected by the fact that some of them have more or less power than others. One of them actually, I don't know for a fact that this is true, but I've heard that dreadlocks as a term was called because the sight of dreadlocks was meant to be scary to white US people. I'm putting my hands up, I don't know for a fact, this could
It's
well be a
dread of
fact.
the Lord. It's an Old Testament thing. You have
Okay.
fear and trembling before the Lord rather than because they created dread in white people in the United States. The Rastafari movement is very, very heavily founded upon Old Testament scripture.
Okay. My bad then. But certainly with, say, black people's hair, there's lots of studies showing that people get, it's considered unprofessional in certain workplace environments. And for black men, this has led a lot of the times, because for men, aesthetic appearance is less important than women, this has led to a lot of black men opting to shave their head entirely and go
Sure.
around bald before male pattern baldness sets in, which may be a smart choice for some of them. Um, maybe, maybe some white people wish they could adopt that as a cultural trend as well, before the inevitable sets in. But what is it? The point is that that act of them shaving their head, rather than viewing that cultural trend as just a cultural thing and like that's just black culture, I think what this sentence is saying is that critical race theorists started to ask, well, why have they started doing that? What, even like a matter of black people, like you said earlier, maybe being more, I don't want to say aggressive, more demanding, more pushy in stores and such. Critical race theorists, drawing on this feminist ideas, they were asking, well, where does that come from? Why are black people maybe a bit more pushy? And if we take the shop example, it's possible, I would argue, that black people in the UK have become more pushy because they've had multiple experiences of being in a store, and being ignored in stores.
Possibility. But you talk about the business with the hair. I know it's a big thing, and there was a case recently at a school in London where the school had a rule about hairstyles and hair length, and it was held to be racist. But of course, if you go back 50 years, men having long hair, generally white men having long hair, was a bar to employment. A lot of people wouldn't employ a man who had long hair. Many schools have policies that the students had to have their hair cut short and short back and sides. This wasn't a racial thing. It might be annoying, it might be an infringement of personal liberty, but it's nothing to do, or it was nothing to do with race in those days. I used to have hair down to my shoulders. People wouldn't give me a job because I had long hair. It's exactly the same for black people now with dreadlocks. If you choose to do something which is outside mainstream society's ideas of what is acceptable for a man or woman, there's going to be certain consequences. And sometimes, if you make the choice to go against the norm, then you just have to put up with the consequences as a result.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I guess that what they're saying in this book is that having drawn from the examples by feminist scholars, these critical race theorists were asking, well, why is it that black people are more likely to make these kinds of choices? What societal factors may contribute to that? And therefore, can we address these factors to make things more equitable? Because with the specific example of hair, you acknowledge that in the past, say that this long hair was a barrier to employment for everyone equally, and this
Oh,
is true. But even you're even acknowledging in your example that it's going to disproportionately affect people nowadays, right? Because with the example of long hair, it's entirely possible that because of various cultural factors, it may be easier for black men if they have long hair to do it in dreadlocks. I don't know much about the specific biology of how black hair works compared to like, well, European, because I think that there's different kinds of, it's not like a single delineation, there's different spectra and it's
mm,
complicated and there's hair types and I don't know any of that. I didn't even know the South Asian stuff for hair. But but the point is that that may be what's, say, more naturally easy for black men to do with their hair, and therefore it's society's reaction to that long hair can disproportionately affect, say, black people, even if the standard is applied equally, if that makes sense. Let's say
yes,
it's hypothetical if it
I,
was, yeah, go on.
except that if once you start growing your hair in that way, which looks odd to a lot of people in dreadlocks, you are making a statement. You're doing it. You're making a statement that you are not following the same general rules as everybody else in the society in which you live. You are deliberately setting out to make yourself something of an outsider, and you'll succeed in that. If I decided to grow my hair long, if I decided to walk down the street without wearing any trousers, I've got a perfect right to do so, but I'm going to make myself an outsider. I'm going to set myself outside the normal boundaries of society. And that's sometimes what people like the Rastafarians do.
So I think that part of the problem with this is that if you think about it with the case of a black man, or even a black woman, there are few options for what they do. Because if dreadlocks get regarded as unprofessional, an afro I oftentimes think is also regarded as unprofessional, and there have been many people writing on afros being regarded as not acceptable for the workplace. But if you think about it, that for a black person, the afro is an equivalent of just shoulder length hair on a white woman, but just plain shoulder length hair. It's the natural state. If a black man shaves his head and lets it grow, I mean, I shaved my head 2 or so years ago and let it grow, and this is the result. But for a black man, he shaves his head and lets it grow. It'll be an afro, a large afro, but that afro gets regarded as unprofessional, or for a black woman, whereas my hair does not get regarded as unprofessional, even though it's
Well,
also long.
yes, of course, that is a reasonable point.
So my point is that they have it's this is an intersection of the biology with social norms and social concepts of race, but it's therefore asking in that context where dreadlocks may be regarded as for a black man may be regarded as unprofessional because they're too long. An afro, even of similar length to white guys, may be regarded as disruptive in a workplace, and therefore a lot of black men opt to shave their head. It's saying that that is not just a black cultural thing. It may become a black cultural symbol and a standard in black community, but it's a consequence of power. This is what they're saying here, and the construction of social roles. That's what they mean by that. I think they're asking you to consider the ways in which power affects culture and affects individual behavior. But they're not saying what I said is my issue with this book.
Yeah, yeah. No, 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 I do get that, Bella.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the main thing I want to really drive home, and that's the reason I want to actually read this book, is that the ideas. First of all, I honestly, the ideas aren't as inflammatory and they aren't attacking people directly as much as one would think. Because this book is primarily about Black and Latinx Americans, right? None of even the ethnic minorities here have nothing to do with my personal racial ethnic background or whatever. So I could regard all of this stuff as an attack on me as well. And I also have a lot of the biases that they're going to talk about in this book. And I think that if we if somebody reads, say, this paragraph that I've highlighted, and they're telling me I'm sexist and I'm patriarchal and I'm dominating, I don't think I am, but they're not letting me explain why I am. They won't tell me why, and they're just saying it in language to make me look like I'm stupid. I can absolutely see why people react negatively against it. But I'm trying to get across to people that that's not what it's saying. It's not really an attack on you personally. The people at this book, let me put it this way, they are angry, but they're not angry at individual people. They certainly aren't angry at you or at me. They're angry at. I mean, if we go up to where they've highlighted specific legal cases, they have talked about. They had the one, here we are, about the woman who pays more than the average white male paying for a car. They're talking about these legal cases, these systematic issues with regards to pricing and sales, which is mostly done by powerful corporations, by education system, by politicians, and by government. That's the target of the anger, not really individuals. And I need to emphasize that any person talking about critical race theory, gender theory, all of this, who is using it as a means to attack the individual and to really go after you personally, unless you are insistently doing something rude and disrespectful to somebody because of your biases and you're refusing to at least try and consider their point of view, because that can be frankly racist or transphobic or anything, that person is, I think, being disingenuous in their use of critical race theory. That's not what critical race theory is. That's not what this book is about. The
Mhm.
targets of this book are very clear. It's government. It's corporations. It's the powerful. It's not people, individual people with relatively little power. So, passionate rant over. Principal figures. This is mostly a bunch of names, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah, the usual suspects. I recognise a lot of them.
I recognize almost none of these. Truly, I've heard of. Well, I think I may have heard of Crenshaw, but that's about it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is legal stuff that I'm not going to know much about. So let's talk about the spin-off movements here. It began as a movement in law, and it quickly spread beyond that discipline. And I did a video on recently about critical race theory and the classics, like Latin and Greek. And I said a similar thing to what I'm saying here, that when classicists talk about decolonizing curricula and bringing critical race theory, it's literally just saying, hey, let's look at texts through these perspectives and see what we get out of them. It's not saying that everything is wrong as an
Sure.
approach. Yeah. Here's another one, intersectionality. I feel like they explain intersectionality very poorly here. Out of curiosity, I'll check the glossary, but what impression of intersectionality did you get from that?
The impression I got was that um, things like race, gender, sexuality, and class, they can all meet together in one individual or one person, and that can make discussing prejudice or discussing the position of somebody in society very difficult.
That's that's a fair understanding of it. Yeah. Let's see what they say in the glossary. Believe that individuals and classes often have shared or overlapping interests or traits. I mean, this is true.
It's a bit woolly. I think I could have done better than that personally.
I think I would explain it as there are certain social phenomena which cannot be explained this by the influence of a single kind of social bias of social power and can be explained by an intersection of them. An example I might give would be brutalization of specifically black male bodies by the police, because people often bring up, say, that white men are also disproportionately attacked by the police relative to white women. And so there's definitely a thing that men are more likely to be violently attacked than women. So that's one thing. But also, white men as a proportion are violently attacked, less so as a proportion, not as a raw number, than black men. So explaining why black men may be more likely to be violently beaten by police in the US, in the northern US, we can't explain this by looking at it only from a feminist perspective or a men's rights activist perspective and only from a race perspective. We have to use both of them together and say that in the case of black men, they're being treated in this way specifically because of being a black man. So it's a problem of being a black man that a black woman doesn't have
Or
and
perhaps
a white man doesn't
specifically
have.
because they're more likely to start shooting their mouths off when the policeman stops them. You get along. It's not as simple as they're being targeted just because they're black men. It's really not. If the police stop you and you speak to them humbly and politely, which is my invariable practice, they're more likely to go easy on you than if you start shouting the odds. So it comes back to culture as well. That sometimes, different cultural behaviour, different body language. Caribbeans, for example, tend to stand closer to people when they're speaking. They tend to make more steady eye contact. It's not. I don't find it aggressive. If a black man comes up to me and he starts speaking directly into my face and he's making continuous eye contact, that's fine. I was working at a further education college last year. It doesn't bother me at all. It's a cultural thing. Some people take it as aggressive. And if you start going right up to a policeman like that, looking him in the eyes, making eye contact, and speaking more loudly than usual, and moving closer to him than is usual, it's going to trigger a response. Some of this is, again, it's the beginning of a misunderstanding based on cultural things rather than simple racial prejudice.
I mean, with the specific case, from the black people I've known in my life, I've not known that to be the case. Maybe. I mean,
No, I'm not saying it's invariably the case. I'm saying
yeah,
it's a factor. All these things work on percentages, don't they?
of
It's
course.
not the case that all black men get beaten up by the police. It's not the case that all white police officers beat up black men. We're talking now about percentages and ratios, and there's a million different factors going into it.
Yeah, and that those million different factors are intersectionality. But you
Yeah.
acknowledged earlier that, say, perception of the same action can be regarded as aggressive or less aggressive, depending on uh, racial biases. One of the
It's certainly the
scariest.
case that a lot of people find black men threatening and menacing. I wouldn't deny that for a single moment. I don't happen to personally. As I say, when I worked at the college, some of these black youths would get ticked off with me and they would stand close to me and, staring at me. And it didn't bother me in the slightest. Some people don't like it. Some people interpret that as aggression. And that's how the thing often starts. That's how trouble can start because people are instinctively a little nervous. A lot of white people are nervous of black men. It's just the way things are. It's unfortunate and it shouldn't be, but they are. So it can only take a little bit of behavior that is seen as being more aggressive. And that's when things can kick off. I don't think it's not the black people's fault. This isn't a question of fault or blame or anything else. It's a question of misunderstanding of body language and misunderstanding of um, the way that people behave.
But do you not think that these misunderstandings of body language, because it seems to be not just a coincidence that loads of people have the same misinterpretations, right? You say it's a cultural thing.
It's not a coincidence at all. A lot of white people are actually nervous of black people. It's a fact. It's unfortunate. It is a fact, and it shouldn't be. And I hope that sometime in the future it won't be. It happens to be the case that a lot of white people are nervous of black people, and it takes a small thing for that nervousness to turn into fear. And once people are afraid, they become aggressive. And I'm fairly sure that sometimes happens with the police.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying is that so we're acknowledging that broader sort of cultural and social biases can create or affect the rates at which this data occurs, like the rates
Yeah,
at which black people get
yeah, of
recorded.
course. Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
good.
definitely.
I think it's important to acknowledge, and that's what they're asking us to acknowledge in this
But
book, which is
also,
good.
but also, there are other things that happen. I mean, there's a greater number of black people that have smoked windscreens, tinted glass in side windows in cars. It shouldn't attract attention. It does attract attention. I'm not saying those people are more likely to be gangsters or drug dealers than anybody else. They're not. It's a fashion thing. But the sight of tinted car windows is a trigger for the police. It raises suspicion, and that can start things off. There's millions of different factors going on here.
To be sure, to be sure. I guess from a critical race theory perspective, what they're asking is that we consider why, like with the hair, why these things may be the case. And we've already gone into discussing that, so we won't cover the same ground with the case of
Hmm.
tinted windows. One thing I realized just came to my mind with the examples you gave of staring, and I said that the black people I've known have not, to my recollection, been like that. I wonder if that's a function of social class, and perhaps
Of course it is.
what.
You don't. I'm fairly sure that you don't associate with black road sweepers or Jamaican bus drivers. You're because of your situation. Because you're an academic. You come into contact with a different sort of person. It's not. It's class, surely, rather than anything else, rather than race.
Yeah, I had a very middle class social life and upbringing. But
Sure.
what I wonder about, and this is, I don't have a statement on it either way. I'm just very curious as to whether minorities of higher socioeconomic statuses have less noticeable cultural difference to white English people than working class
Yes,
minorities.
yes, of course they do. Yeah, that's rather. But you see, the black middle class is much smaller than the white middle class, and it's smaller than the Chinese middle class or the Indian middle class. There's not. This is to do with income and so on. For whatever reason, there are fewer middle class black people.
Yeah, for various reasons which we don't have
Mm.
time to go into here.
No, no.
But yeah, no, this is good. So we've covered intersectionality. That's good. Oh, the activist dimension is something that I've seen people make a big deal of, because it's something that is quite common with queer theory as well. Queer theory is also Philosophy Tube is a great YouTube channel, and she's talked about this, saying that queer theory professors were out in the streets protesting when they weren't in the classroom teaching. And personally, I quite like that. I think that we should be trying to bring about social change that we regard as positive, as most people are. I guess I would say that as a means of distinguishing that critical race theorists, queer theorists, literary scholars, we're not. I mean, I'm not. I'm only a literary scholar, but these groups are not social scientists. Then they don't have a duty to objectively show what's real, and or to follow some sort of objective fact finding approach. They can make statements about what it should be. Like an anthropologist or a sociologist, I certainly think should not really have an activist dimension. They shouldn't go out there and be like, "This is how society should be." There are debates about this within anthropology, but for the most part, I would say they shouldn't. But a critical race theorist, a queer theorist, they're writing theory. The reason we write theory and think about things and formulate ideas is to help us better interact with our world. And some people want to make changes in the world, and that's what the activist dimension is. So
Hmm.
I don't think it's a hidden agenda thing, as some people
No, not a
think
bit
it
of
is.
that.
It's quite an open agenda, really. Um, what do critical race theorists believe? And they talk about how not every writer would subscribe to everything, but they've got these two tenets which I think are interesting. So, first, racism is ordinary, not aberrational. I find this phrase, I've not heard this phrase before, but normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country, that country being America.
They're saying it's like background radiation. It's there constantly. It's not something, for a lot of white people, the idea of racism or racist incidents, these things are sort of one-offs. They're unusual. A lot of white people see a racist event as something exceptional. Oh, that person was being racist. That's not the perspective here. The perspective here is that racism is absolutely endemic, and that even just walking down the street, you're going to encounter racism because it's embedded in society.
I think it's not just a matter of regarding racism as exceptional. I think we all it's exceptional. People regard it, I should say, as exceptional and as extreme. Like if you notice when people talk about racism on the news, they usually talk about it in conjunction with really extreme political cultural views. They'll talk about white extremists or
Mm.
terrorists and this kind of thing. And I think even when I was taught about racism in history in secondary school, we were taught about it in the context of the racists being the Ku Klux Klan literally going out and lynching black
Sure.
people and the police beating protesters during the March on Washington. And I think when people see that, they get this image that a racist is a really terrible person, which is why you have these amazing interviews in this documentary called I think Blood in the Soil, where they interview a lot of neo Nazis in the US, and there's an amazing clip of one of them saying something to the effect that he thinks that black people are genetically inferior or whatever, but I'm not racist, and I mean, they, they say this because for them, a racist is an extremist. A racist is a person who is literally doing it. And I think that's part of the problem because when somebody hears somebody else saying, this is a microaggression, which they don't understand to begin with because they haven't had it explained to them, your this action that you do, which you think is innocuous, is racist. They think, oh goodness, they're saying that I'm going out there or I want to go out there and lynch black people. That's absolutely
Sure.
not the case, and they have a very negative reaction, and it feels like a really serious moral charge.
Yeah, racism is seen as is almost synonymous with extremism. Yeah.
But I think that's a really important thing to remember is that racism, not just racism, transphobia, homophobia, it's a spectrum. And I think the problem is that people treat it as a zero sum game, as an all or nothing thing. And it's really not. Microaggressions, I would say rather than talking about it in institutional terms all the time, in an academic context, that's fine. But in everyday life, instead of saying this is a microaggression, it hurt me, I would instead say, could you not? Could you maybe not? Could you be nice?
Hmm.
It would be great. And then people would regard it as a bit nicer, just be polite, rather than saying if you're not. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. If you don't like listen to somebody asking you to change your microaggressions, you're being a bit impolite, rather than you're being racist, transphobic, whatever. I understand why, and I talked earlier about how it's useful to have that language as well. But I think when somebody says it with that language, let me rephrase this. When somebody says that's a microaggression, that's racist, that's sexist, again, unless you literally are going out and attacking people, they're not saying that you're doing that. They're saying you're being a bit rude because of these social factors. So could you not? I think that's basically all it is. Let's look at the second assumption. So the proposition rather. Second, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group.
Yes, yes, immediately there's a problem here. I can think, I mean, there are three meanings to the word psychic, obviously. I don't know whether you don't play bridge, I don't suppose, do you?
No, no.
It's an old person's game. You have psychic bidding, in which it's a bit like bluffing in poker. But I imagine in this sense, he's talking about psychic in the sense of the soul. What do you understand him to mean by the word psychic in this sense? You can see how it would be to material advantage, obviously. You can see that racism will bring in an advantage if you can exploit black people, pay them less money, or mistreat them, and so on. That's a material advantage. What do you understand by psychic advantage?
Yeah, I think you're right in like the soul. I think it's a deliberately loosely defined term. I bristle a bit at it because when I hear psychic, I think of psychoanalysis, which I'm going to do a video about because I have particular objections to. And I realized when reflecting on my own objections to psychoanalysis that my issues were very similar to the issues that people in your audience had with me defending, say, critical race theory. So I understand it, and I'm trying to come at it more from their point of view and their perspective. But psychic, I would say, yeah, it's the psychological, it's the mental peace of mind, the kind of thing. Yeah, all the rest of this.
But he doesn't say what psychic purpose is served by racism.
Well, okay, so it's a bit of a stereotype, and I don't like this. But one of the common explanations of racism is that it's useful to divide, say, a working class because it lets people who materially don't have very much because they're like white poor people.
Oh yeah, of course. Yes, yes. The poor whites, at least they've got someone they can feel superior to. Yeah,
Mm.
that it certainly served that function in the United States after the American Civil War. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also part of why intersectionality is really important, right? Because I think when people hear intersectionality and they're saying we need to consider critical race theory and we need to consider race issues when we're talking about class, I think people hear that and say we're going to only talk about black people's issues. We're not going to talk about white people's issues because we're bringing this racial stuff in. And same thing with gender. When people think, oh, we're going to talk about gender theory, they mean we're going to talk about women and trans people. And no, that's not the, lots of gender theory is about men. Raywin Collins does really fascinating work on masculinities. And this is also important because we can't understand how to address men's issues, how to address white people's issues without considering all of these other factors. Because if, like you said, if white people aren't unionizing with their black co-workers because they feel this sense of racial identity and they feel like black people are going to undermine their racial cohesion, and they don't include them in a union, that union may lose and it may not have as much bargaining power, and it keeps the wealthy wealthy and it keeps the poor people poor. So you're right. It definitely serves a lot of functions for the powerful, often because of class interests in society. This is so they explain it a bit more here. Oh, and there's the black PhD example that I highlighted and said
Yeah.
I don't like this. So ordinariness means that racism is difficult to address or cure because it's not acknowledged. Colorblind or formal conceptions of inequality of equality expressed in rules that insist only on treatment that's the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining or an immigration dragnet in a food processing plant. So this is, I think, what we were talking about earlier about how a policy against long hair could affect black people more often than white people.
Yeah.
Yeah, for no fault of their own. The second feature, called interest convergence, God, it's another term, or material determinism, adds a further dimension. Because material determinism is a massive, difficult thing, and I wish they explained it here. So, like, what did you make of this bit?
I found it a little bit odd. I'm not sure how many people would understand the idea of advancing the interests of what working class white people psychically actually means. And I'm not even sure how relevant that is today. Yeah, it was certainly relevant in the after the American Civil War for the poor whites. I'm not sure how much psychic advantage the average working class white person now gets from racism.
It's a debatable point, to be sure, how much psychic advantage they get from it. One of them I can see might be this sense of feeling more included within society than excluded. And if you feel less included, you may have a sense of unease, of feeling like you don't quite belong. And this can be expressed even in terms of culture, like treating, say, the classics, Latin and Greek, as these white things that we associate only with or predominantly with white people. Especially if we talk about them in ways that signal that we care about the Romans being white rather than the Romans being Roman. I think that can cause a kind of psychic imbalance that makes minorities feel less connected to Western civilization and also less interested in preserving and studying it, which I'm frankly very concerned about. I want more people to study Latin. So, yeah.
You
So I
see
would.
that at Oxford, the number of people wanting to study classics. You get an awful lot of black people signing up or applying for, say, medicine and law and so on. You hardly get anybody wanting to do classics.
Yeah, if you, I was part of this is going to sound like the most pretentious thing, and I'm very sorry. I was part of like a secret Latin-speaking society at Oxford. It's really not like Illuminati shit. We just play board games in Latin, but
Mhm.
it was fun. But the point is, aside from myself, if I'm counted as a person of color, because usually they think I'm Italian or Spanish or Latino or something. There was one dude from India who was really good at Latin who was there, and everyone else was very white British. But Oxford's a bit of an exception, really, because it's really egalitarian and the university is committed to being as equal as possible with its admissions. You get people from all over the world coming there, so you have a good deal more people from around the world, including
That's
non-white
not being
people.
egalitarian. That's managing to get full fees from overseas students, Bella.
I mean, yes and no. I mean,
Yeah,
because
no, well, what's the no part of that?
well, because those people from
They don't
overseas,
want
they
home students left to themselves. They'd rather have nothing but overseas students, preferably from Singapore.
well, I mean, but I don't think they can because those students from abroad have to pass the same admission standards as
They do indeed.
homegrown
Yeah,
students. Yeah,
yes, yeah.
like
That's
in terms.
why. That's why there's so many from Singapore and China, obviously.
Well, yeah. I mean, but I mean, I think that financial incentive applies to literally every UK or rather maybe every UK university that
Of course it does.
charges
No,
the
no, no. I
minimum fee.
wasn't singling
No, no,
Oxford
it's fine.
out.
I mean, I'm not like desperately keen to defend Oxford. There's a lot that the university does very badly wrong, but It's a whole thing. So to round up in interest convergence from material determinism, I would say that what this is trying to communicate is that racism unites the material interests of different groups. Although again, they don't explain or give examples for why. I
How
wish
is
they
this in the
did.
benefits of white elites? It doesn't say what the material benefits are.
Okay, so
So
benefits for.
divide and rule of the working classes, yes, anything that divides the proletariat is good. But I mean, what other material benefits can you think of?
Okay, so I'll give an example of like, a typical Marxist factory owner example, and this is the U.S. So I'll go with the U.S. Immigration
Mhm.
law. The bright child who raised her hand hesitates, knowing that her parents are undocumented entrants who fear being discovered and deported. This is an example of one of these acts that somebody might experience in
Does
life.
that benefit the white elite materially?
So let's say that that child's parents are working in a factory. That and say the white documented members of that factory form a union and petition for higher wages. Her parents may not be able to do that because if they join the strike and if they protest for higher wages, the employer could out them to ICE and have them deported and ruin their whole family situation. So the factory owner benefits from having a system which this racially nationally discriminates against this child's parents
Mm.
because then the child's parents can't ask for more money. Race can be used as a race can be used as a means of getting prison labor in the US is a great one. Critical race theorists often talk about how slavery wasn't outlawed in the US; it was outlawed with the exception of imprisonment for a crime. And prison labor in the US does loads of work for incredibly low amounts of money, disproportionately using black labor. And that definitely benefits the elite to get a ton of free work out of it. Um,
Mm. Well, we probably haven't got time to go
yeah,
too deeply in that, but I can think of a few things on that subject.
we
Continue.
will have future weeks. We're almost at the end of the
Yeah.
chapter. The social construction piece. This is something that your audience was very passionate about. I, we didn't talk much about the biological side of race because we acknowledge that the factors that appear to be biological can have a social element to it, and because we can change the social element, we should focus on changing the social conditions as a priority rather because nothing about biology is going to change. Holds so this social construction thesis holds that race and races are the products of social thought and relations, not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. So, I mean, black is an example, right? Black.
But that's debatable. That's sociologists' view. That's not the view often of biologists, is it?
Also,
It, well, no, actually, it isn't. This is, but what he's doing here, he's saying, if you go down, you'll say he says things. For example, he talks of scientific truths, but
scientific
they're not
truths.
scientific truths. When he's talking about the idea of race as a social construct, you'll often hear this said, and he says it there. Hold,
Hang on.
wait a minute. Right. That society frequently chooses to ignore these scientific truths. He hasn't demonstrated that they're scientific truths. We can't go to sociologists to demonstrate that. We need to consult biologists and geneticists. This is a gag I use myself. I mean, I write books, yeah. I often call to science. I will say things like, for example, it is widely accepted, or, few people would disagree that so and so, or scientists agree. It's not, there's a whole lot here that is very debatable.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say because I did biological anthropology at university as well. Like we learned about the way that race impacts your biology and how your body reacts to certain things. I think the point of it is that those biological realities don't correspond with the linguistics and the social categories. I often say that language makes visible a lot of social things that we can then see better and understand better. And I think the point that's being made here is that people think and they claim that these ethnicity labels like black, white, whatever, correspond to a biological or genetic reality.
Well, of
It,
course they can do, because black African Americans have 15% more free testosterone circulating in their bloodstream. They do. That's why black Americans have black American men have the highest rates of prostate cancer in the world, because it's stimulated, growth is stimulated by testosterone, they have more testosterone. That in itself is associated. If you go to the average prison, you were talking about the number of black people in prison. If you go to a prison and test everyone for testosterone, you'll find that those that are in for violent offences have high levels of testosterone, regardless of whether they're black or white. Increased levels of testosterone are associated with increased aggression. That's a biological difference.
so, like, we talked about it last time. We talked about how like these biological differences can be affected by social issues, and I don't know enough about the biology or the social context of this particular case of free testosterone to go into it. I mean, I believe that these can be influenced by social class. Your diet can influence your testosterone levels, etc. But my point is that it's not that these biological things aren't real. So I'm not contesting that Black Americans uh, have a higher percentage of free testosterone in their blood. The point is that the label black that we use when we're talking does not mean that, does not match on to anything that's biologically consistent. By which because the label black, for instance, might be applied to black Africans as well, and I don't know if they do have relative to white Europeans, for instance, that same
Yeah.
higher percentage.
Well, I'm afraid that these things do. The situation with black Americans is that most of them have, on average, about 15 or 20% white ancestry as well. So it's slightly more complicated. But these things, these inherent differences can affect all sorts of things. They can affect behavior, they can affect how likely someone is to go to prison and things like that. So I'm going to have to disagree with the idea that these are scientific truths. He puts it forward very neatly, and he's made it slip an awful lot past. We'll have to go into this on another occasion, Bella,
Yeah,
because this is
yeah.
quite a deep thing. Always suspicious when people refer to scientists agree. I was looking through a book here, Ali Ratansi's Racism, a very short introduction, the series, and he says exactly the same here. He talked about scientists agree, and what scientists say, scientific research, that race is a social construct. And again, he's saying in effect sociologists agree, but biologists don't agree, nor the geneticists.
Yeah, okay. We will talk about this in a different time because I don't have the knowledge right now to go fully into the biology of it. But it's a good point to note for a future week.
Mm.
So, differential racialization, I think this is one of the terms, just a buzzword, but it seems it's reasonable enough. It's just that culture creates different ethnic groups at different times for different reasons. Oh, goodness. Muslims are a good one, like treating Muslims as an ethnicity rather than a religion. They give this example. People, because that's why there was that famous, I think it was some actor appearing on Bill Maher, and he said that Bill Maher is being racist for being Islamophobic, and Bill Maher said it's a religion, not a race. But in the American consciousness, Muslim is sort of a racial-ish group now because of various factors after 9/11. I think that's all that they're saying. It's why the Irish at one point were considered non-white, all of these issues.
In the 19th century, indeed, they were regarded, but that's because of false history. The Iberians were regarded as an African people, and originally the idea was that the Irish were Iberian, that there'd been an African race in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal, and they'd migrated to Ireland. So the black people were thought to be racially, the Irish were thought to be racially black.
I didn't know that. I would have
Oh,
assumed it
yeah.
would have. I would have assumed it would have come from the Norman conquest and the history of racializing the Irish as different, so that we can conquer them as English people.
No, there's a whole pseudo history behind this. It's all complete nonsense, obviously. Charles Kingsley, who wrote The Water Babies and Westward Ho, he visited Ireland and described them as human chimpanzees.
Goodness. Yeah.
Yeah, well, right.
So, yeah, this is just going on more about how like the categories of racial groups can change over time, but we don't have much of an issue with that. Intersectionality and anti-essentialism. The anti-essentialism is the last point I want to just clarify that no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity, which is that like I would maybe rephrase this as when we talk about identity, it changes depending on the environment we're in. Like, it's going to sound really weird, but I speak Esperanto and I might consider myself like part of the Esperanto culture when I'm meeting with other Esperantists. But I don't meet people, shake their hands, and go, "Hi, I'm from Moyosuyo, or I'm from Esperantuyo. Nice to meet you," kind of thing. Or I don't go, "I'm not British. I'm Esperantist," or whatever. Some people do because they take it a bit too far and they need to chill. But um, and likewise, I don't go to people, shake their hands, and go, "Hi, I'm a trans woman." But in a conversation about trans rights in the UK, I may say, "As a trans woman, this affects me more, and I've seen these things." I think that's literally all that it is, in that regard. So we've got that voice of color thesis. We talked about this last time because it's basically just standpoint epistemology, which I think is easy to abuse term, let's say.
And it brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race. Yeah.
I mean, I don't like this personally. I think it does treat people as a monolith. My mother is not white, but she's incredibly racist and also doesn't know much about sociology or all the biology of race, frankly. So I certainly wouldn't take her opinion. Oh, I just one quick rant. I normally don't get treated as non-white, but the one time I did in my secondary school really annoyed me. It's this white liberal woman, and I disagreed with her that cultural appropriation is always this terribly racist thing, and we used to argue about this. And on her blog back then, at one point somebody asked about it, and she said, "As a white person, I can't talk about it. Here's a link to a person of color's blog who thinks it is really racist, and here's a link to somebody who thinks a person of color who thinks it isn't, my blog." And I got really mad about that, and I was like, "You're not treating me as a person with an opinion. You're treating me as like a person of color with an opinion. Like, f off. It's insulting. I had an opinion. You could have talked about my opinion."
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's white liberals for you, I'm afraid.
unfortunately, yes, I don't love a lot of white liberals. A lot of it's very about themselves rather than
Yeah,
the
it's all
cause.
about themselves.
How much racism is there in the world? I feel like that's a bit too much for us to get into, but
Yeah, I don't
yeah,
think better embark upon that at this late stage.
because we're basically at the end now. So we've
Yeah.
gotten through the first chapter, and that was good. So next week, I think we should talk. We'll read and talk about chapter 2, and they're going to go into more detail about. So maybe they'll give these examples: interest convergence, material determinism, revisionist interpretations, critique of liberalism, etc. Awesome. Do we have any final thoughts to round out this
No.
session?
I think we've pretty well covered the field.
Yeah, brilliant. Awesome. Bit of a, I guess, self plug. It's not really, but I've made a Discord server for this channel, and I've also put in a channel of that Discord server the PDF of this book. So if anybody watching this video wants to read this book along with us each week, and also join a discussion about it, I'll leave a link to the Discord server in the description of this video, and you can go and access this book, and you can read it. You can agree, you can disagree, you can have a great time, take part in the discussion. Thank you so much, Simon, for doing this discussion. I think it was productive. I'm looking forward to chapter 2 next week. It's going to be good.
Same here.
It was great talking with you. Thank you so much. I hope you have a good week. And to everyone watching, bye.